Greetings, friends and neighbors, and welcome to my study again. Today we're going to talk about thesis statements, an important part of academic writing. In most academic writing, you are trying to make a claim or establish a persuasive point of view or argue something. And to do that effectively, you need to let your readers know what it is you're claiming or what you want them to come away convinced of or persuaded of. Okay, so your thesis statement does that for you, and you usually begin an essay or a work of argumentative writing with a thesis statement. Fairly early in your writing, you establish the claim that you intend to defend and support throughout the rest of the essay or piece of writing that you're working on. Okay, so we're going to look at the Purdue Writing Lab worksheet from the OWL Purdue Online Writing Lab that talks about thesis statements and what constitutes a strong thesis statement. Thesis statements can be weak, they can be ineffective, they can be very good. To be effective, they need to be very good and strong, obviously. So let's look at the first statement on this Writing Lab worksheet. It says the thesis statement or main claim must be debatable. Now, that's something people often lose sight of when they haven't thought through what a thesis statement is and what it is an academic piece of argumentative writing is trying to do. It's trying to establish a point of view, essentially. And to do that, it needs to have a claim that reasonable people could differ on. So it's something very outrageous or it's something very bland, something that's generally accepted as true. It's not going to be a very good argumentative paper because what's the point of writing something that everyone pretty much agrees on? So your claim, your main claim, or your thesis statement needs to be debatable. In other words, something that people could reasonably have differing opinions on. Now, if it's something, as we said, that's generally agreed upon, then it's really no topic that anyone is going to be interested in, or why would you bother writing about it in the first place? So here's an example of a non-debatable thesis statement, one that really doesn't work very well because it's generally agreed upon. Pollution is bad for the environment. Pollution is bad for the environment. Not debatable. Most everyone knows that. We don't like pollution. Pollution damages. Nobody who argues for or against environmental policies would argue with the idea that pollution isn't a good thing. They might argue about various forms of pollution control and whether that's a good thing or not, but they won't argue the basic concept here. So that's not a good thesis statement. It's not debatable. So let's look at an example of a debatable thesis statement. At least 25% of the federal budget should be spent on limiting pollution. Okay, now you're into a question of allocation of resources, and a lot of people will have opinions one side or the other. You could have an opinion that says 25% is nowhere near enough of the federal budget to be spent on limiting pollution. Or you could say nobody should be limiting pollution with the federal budget. We shouldn't be allocating money that way. We have too many other more urgent needs. So there's a lot of room for debate on this. So this is an example of a debatable thesis statement, something that you can go ahead and try to convince your readers of by supporting it with evidence and organizing your argument in a logical, persuasive way. Others, as it points out in this paragraph, others might feel we should be spending more money on education. Others could argue that corporations, not the government, should be paying to limit pollution, and so on. So that's basically why that is a debatable thesis statement. Here's another example of a debatable thesis statement. America's anti-pollution efforts should focus on privately owned cars. You know, now you're getting very narrow here. You're getting very specific with this statement, and it can be debatable. It's very debatable. America's anti-pollution efforts should focus on privately owned cars. And here's another room for disagreement between rational individuals, as the paragraph below points out. You might think that focusing on recycling programs is a better idea than private automobiles, or controlling pollution from manufacturing plants, or something like that. Okay, the thesis needs to be narrow. Let's scroll up a little bit here. The thesis needs to be narrow. So the scope of your paper might seem overwhelming at the start, as they point out here. Generally, the narrower the thesis, the more effective your argument will be. In other words, don't try to argue something grand and comprehensive and overarching. It's very difficult to do. You can't amass enough points to say something very extensive about a very broad statement. So your thesis has to be supported by evidence, as we pointed out here. And the more evidence you need, the tougher it is going to be to do. So here's a thesis that is too broad. Drug use is detrimental to society. Okay, perhaps that's debatable, but it's too broad. Detrimental to society is a very general statement. In what ways is it detrimental to society? Drug use by whom? There's all kinds of things that you can't really identify as the focus of a good argument here with just that statement. Talking about illegal drug use, recreational drug use, for example, medication. What are we talking about here? It's just too much to take on and to argue effectively. Okay, so let's scroll down a little more on this sheet. We come to an example of a narrow or focused thesis here. Illegal drug use is detrimental because it encourages gang violence. Okay, so now we have something that is more narrow. We have drug use qualified as meaning illegal drug use. Detrimental remains, but we're giving a reason. It's detrimental because it encourages gang violence. Okay, a very specific point that can now be argued. You can look at that in a sense that you can bring evidence to bear on, and you can make a case of drug use as an aggravator of gang violence. That's more manageable. Okay, let's narrow debatable thesis 1 up there, the one about the federal budget and expenditures on pollution. And let's see how we can make that a more narrow kind of statement. If we say at least 25% of the federal budget should be spent on pollution control, as we said before, we can make that more debatable and more focused, more narrow, if we say should be spent on helping upgrade business to clean technologies, researching renewable energy sources, and planting more trees in order to control or eliminate pollution. So we've got 3 main points that we have that we are going to argue in this particular piece of work as a good way to spend budget to control pollution. It narrows the scope. It allows you to kind of mount arguments and provide evidence in those categories. And it's not just something that says 25% of the money should be used in a general sort of way. We can further narrow also the debatable thesis number 2 by saying the America's anti-pollution efforts should focus on privately owned cars because it would allow most citizens to contribute to national efforts and care about the outcome. So it's saying there's a reason why we're focusing on privately owned cars rather than other popular options or possible options for focusing our efforts in anti-pollution. So we're saying this would allow most citizens to contribute to the effort. So it involves a lot of people. It gets people caring about the outcome of the program. Okay, so we've narrowed that even further. And there's some thoughts by the authors of this worksheet as to how this particularly works. Qualifiers, it says, such as typically, generally, usually, or on average, also help to limit the scope of your claim by allowing for the almost inevitable exception to the rule. So there's going to be exceptions to the rule. But this is a narrow thesis, should focus on privately owned cars because it would allow most citizens, as a qualifying statement, to contribute, etc. Okay, what types of claims should we consider in writing our thesis statement, in developing it? Our claim. What type of claim are we involved in? Let's move down here to this. Claims fall into one of 4 categories. We can think about how we want to approach the topic and what type of claim you want to make. That's one way to focus your thesis on one particular aspect of your broader topic. So we have several possibilities. The first one we're going to look at is claims of fact or definition. Fact or definition. Now, these argue about what the definition of something is or whether something is a settled fact. And here's an example. That's the best way to understand this particular type of claim. An example of a fact or definition claim. What some people refer to as global warming is actually nothing more than normal long-term cycles of climate change. So that's a claim of fact. We're going to have to support it, of course, to be credible. It's also debatable, but it has to do with a fact or a definition of global warming. Okay, so you can see where that argument might go. Another way of stating a claim would be in terms of cause and effect. And as it says here, these claims argue that one person, thing, or event caused another thing or event to occur. Again, we can see it more clearly in the example. The popularity of SUVs in America has caused pollution to increase. Cause and effect. What caused pollution to increase? The popularity of SUVs in America. And then, of course, we do, have to provide evidence, support our claim, and work our argument through to a reasonable and logical conclusion. What about claims about value? Move up the scroll a little bit here. These claims are made about what something is worth. Value, whether we value it or not, how we would rate or categorize something. So it's a claim about value. Here's the example. Global warming is the most pressing challenge facing the world today. Global warming is the most pressing challenge facing the world today. That has to do with values. We're saying that is a more pressing claim than many other challenges that we face. Global warming. Okay, we can see where that argument will go, and we have a structure for formulating and presenting our evidence and organizing our thinking in a logical and reasonable way for persuasion to occur among our readers. And the fourth type of claim that we might engage in discussing is our claims about solutions or policies. What do we need to do? There are claims that argue for or against a certain solution or policy approach to the problem. Looking at our pollution example again, we would state a claim of solution or policy, something like this perhaps. Instead of drilling for oil in Alaska, we should be focusing on ways to reduce oil consumption, such as researching renewable energy sources. It's a solution. It's a policy that is being recommended. And we're putting it in the context of instead of looking for more oil and drilling in places that might risk damage to the environment, if that is the argument, we might more productively reduce oil consumption, and then we wouldn't have to go looking for oil all over the place, especially in these sensitive areas. Okay, which type of claim is right for your argument? Okay, which of the theses or claim that you use for your argument you select will depend on your position and knowledge of the topic. For one thing, what do you know about this? What do you believe? What do you want to establish with your readers? Secondly, your readers are a focus on this. Who is your audience? What are they likely to be interested in? What are their concerns? What might they disagree with in your thesis statement? And how might you state that effectively so that you can make an argument that will make the persuasive point that you want to make in your piece of writing? Okay. The context of your paper. What reason are you writing this? Why are you engaging in this? Is this something to persuade somebody of a call to action? So you're looking at a solution or a policy? Is it something you want people to change their opinions on so that they start to move in a direction of understanding enough about a point of view to challenge it or to make change occur? You might go with a value claim there, and so on. You might want to think about where you imagine your audience to be at this point and pinpoint, it says, where you think the biggest difference in viewpoints might be, and then think about what type of claim you want to establish. Okay? The key, as it says at the very end of this sheet, is to identify the controversy or debate you are addressing and to define your position early on in the paper. You're not going to be a very effective arguer for a point of view if you don't tell the reader right off the bat what you are trying to establish. Where are you trying to go with this? If you confuse the reader by making them guess about that, it becomes counterproductive and your argument becomes weaker. Okay, so that's some of the considerations that we need to take into account as we talk about developing strong thesis statements.